Bill's found dead today.
Huh?
Yeah. Just a few hours ago.
Do you know of anybody who would have wanted to do harm to Bill?
Conniving, vindictive, underhanded. It was just lie after lie after lie.
We have a murder now that had been planned, and everybody had a job.
She goes, we might need him taken out.
She picked young, impressionable people and groomed everyone involved.
I was so used to just doing for her without thinking.
That broke me. My heart just hurts so much for her.
You know, she was basically just a puppet.
She found her weakness, and then she played on his emotions.
What kind of monster would rope their own child into committing murder?
What's your problem?
The man's laying on the ground in the middle of the driveway. I think he's dead. I'm not going to touch him or nothing. I'm not going to even open the gate.
All right. I'll get EMS and sheriff en route.
This is not a normal call that Scott County deputies encounter on their daily patrols. It's an isolated location, and the house is positioned down a lane, tucked back in a wooded area.
When officers arrived, there was a chain link fence with a gate.
Beyond that gate, we located a male individual on his back, apparent gunshot wound to the head. The victim was identified as Bill Reynolds. He was 69 years old. There was some blood in his mouth and on the ground. It was very unusual to find the body the way it was, out in the open. There was two dogs. One was on his chest and the other one was licking his ear. It was a disturbing scene.
Whenever officers arrive on a scene like that, oftentimes they wait to move the body.
The coroner was called, and when Bill Reynolds was moved, there was nothing there.
They were checking for any type of weapon that would indicate suicide.
There was no gun found in or around the body, and there was no shell casings.
When none was found, they determined it to be a homicide.
This is a farming community. Everybody knows everybody. Bill seemed like just any old country folk from Scott County. He was a family man, and he liked to work on vehicles and tinker with cars. So who would want to do this to Bill Reynolds? Who has the means, the motive, and the ability?
I got the call. And I broke down crying and screaming. My brother's frantic. Says, Henry, we got to go to Dad's and we got to go now. Something's happened. When we get to the residence, we could see an individual laying there at the fence. So we walked up to get a little closer to the fence, and we knew that was our dad.
It was a pretty messed up scene.
The next move in the investigation is to start collecting evidence, and we'll try to get a timeline established.
Authorities quickly start canvassing the area, talking to people to find out what could have occurred. This really caused investigators to hit a brick wall. It appears as though Bill Reynolds was shot in broad daylight without any witnesses or anyone around. It's so strange.
We were interviewed by the police. They didn't tell us a whole lot other than, you know, our dad was possibly shot execution style in the head with a firearm.
We had nothing at that point. It's a complete whodunit.
Dad had a big heart. He did his best to show us as much love as he possibly could.
I just know that he was a good guy. He'd do anything for you.
He was 18 years old when he was drafted to the Vietnam War. So my dad had seen things in his lifetime that most people aren't going to see. When Dad came back from Vietnam, he liked kind of the extravagant lifestyle. I think it kind of made him feel alive. He loved automobiles.
Corvettes, Mustangs, I mean, he had them all.
Here's one of his cars. He called that the Black Angel?
Yep.
And there was the old Cobra, Mustang Cobra. He also had a NASCAR memorabilia collection that was like no other that I've ever seen.
You name it, he had it.
Dad came over to my house and told me, I've met this lady. I'd like for you to meet her. Her name is Daylene. It was love at first sight.
She put on the charm, and he said he couldn't resist.
Dad seemed to be happy. Daylene was his next chapter in life. He was excited about that.
Soon after Bill met Daylene, she moved into his residence along with her grandchildren, Amaris and Michael. Their mother is Johnetta Hall.
Johnetta was a truck driver, so Daylene was taking care of the grandchildren while Johnetta worked.
My dad opened up his arms totally and accepted Michael and Amaris as part of being with Daylene. You could tell he loved Michael and he loved Amaris too. They had a good relationship.
She looked up to Bill as a dad. I think she just craved having someone care about her the right way.
So Bill took on a family that really needed his attention. And his kind heart stepped right in.
Dad and Daylene were married about a couple of years before Dad got some bad news. He told me he had to go in for esophagus cancer surgery, and they didn't give him a real high percentage to make it through this.
What I gathered from the investigation, that cancer, I believe, took a toll on their marriage.
I never saw Daylene come to the hospital to see him. It seemed to me like Daylene was worried about Daylene.
We found out that during Bill's hospital stay, Daylene became power of attorney for Bill.
Bill also claimed that Daylene put the titles to his home and his vehicles in her name.
Here's a man dying and going through cancer treatment. Why would you do something like that?
Dad makes it through the esophagus surgery and gets out. Excited that he gets to continue on with his life.
Bill comes home from the hospital and says he's shocked to find all of his belongings out on the back porch.
What's going on here? Why is this happening?
I'm sure it was a hard pill to swallow. I gave you a home. I gave you my heart. That's heartless.
You could tell it tore him up. He cried a couple times.
I mean, it's just a sad, sad situation. I took him down to Scott County Courthouse. He filed for divorce. And then he immediately moved in with my brother. Once my dad left the house, Daylene's daughter, Janetta, moved in with her mom to help during the divorce proceedings. It pretty much was a takeover.
For about a year, there was arguing and bickering going on over who was going to get the house.
Amaris would talk about her grandma and Bill fighting and stressing her out. It wasn't pleasant for her.
Eventually, through the divorce proceeding, Bill Reynolds was awarded the marital residence.
It meant that Daylene, Johnetta, Michael, and Amaris had to vacate the property and move out into a small single-wide trailer.
Dad was excited to get back. I mean, that's where he had all of his belongings. But when we opened the door, it was an absolute disaster.
Every room in this house smells of dead dog. Stereo says $300, brand new box, gone.
The animals had peed in there. You know, they did their business in there.
Dog poopy on the floor.
The smell hit us in the face so strong that it'd almost make you throw up. It was awful. They made sure that when they left that this place was going to be pretty much unlivable. It looked like a bomb as it went off.
The diapers all over the place. Why should people be so goddamn hateful and mean?
Then Dad noticed something that was sitting in his chair. And he picked up this can. And on the front of that can, it said gun oil. It was placed there intentionally. And my dad's first reaction when he turned around to look at us is, they're gonna kill me.
September 27th was supposed to be Bill Reynolds' first night back in his residence. He had spent days cleaning the house after the place was left in a state of filth. But Bill was killed that day.
I was angry, and I just stayed silent for a long time. Bill did not deserve any of that.
As part of the investigation, you want to find out where people were at the time of the murder. And anytime you have knowledge of a nasty divorce, the first person you're going to want to speak to is the wife. We traveled to Daylene's house and informed her that we had found Bill deceased. Daylene was not very friendly, and she did not seem surprised. One thing that I found very odd was that she had a lot of cleaning chemicals out. The first thought to your mind is that she's trying to conceal evidence of a crime. Daylene was asked if she owned any firearms. She explained that she did own a .38 revolver, but she hadn't seen it in some time. When we asked Daylene if she shot Bill, she made a very unusual statement that raised the hair on the back of your neck. She said, "It would have been more personal if I killed him. I would have stabbed him or I would have beat him with a bat." Suspicion started to rise. We asked her about her whereabouts on that day. She explained that her and her daughter, Johnetta, had been cleaning, but that Johnetta had stepped out to go get some groceries and had left around 2 p.m. That was the same time we had found Bill deceased.
Some neighbors verified Daylene's story that she, in fact, had been there all day cleaning. Daylene Cates's alibi checks out, but at that stage, anything is still open, and we're not ruling out any suspects.
There is a good way of getting a divorce, and then there is a bad way of getting a divorce. And to be underhanded, that's basically what Daylene did. Daylene was very dominating She always had to have things her way. Whatever she said went, and that was it. Her daughter, Johnetta, was also very angry through this divorce. Explosively angry. She was writing to all her friends on Facebook. How could Bill move her son, her daughter, and her mother out of a home? This how the judicial system here works? I don't think so.
Johnetta was very aggressive. She just seemed like she was a very confrontational individual.
You know how they say like father, like son? Well, this is like mother, like daughter, because they had the same personality, the same characteristics. It was crazy.
It became important that we speak with Johnetta because of the time frame that she left Dalene's house, kind of lining up with the time frame that we found Bill Reynolds in the driveway.
Thank you for coming in.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you for coffee. Let me say, could you say your name?
Johnetta.
Johnetta.
Johnetta seemed very collected, calm, cool. She didn't really inquire what the investigation was about. She just sat there.
Bill's found dead today.
Huh?
Yeah. Just a few hours ago.
When she was notified that Bill was dead, she never once asked how Bill died. That was not of any interest of her. I found that extremely odd.
Do you know of anybody who would have wanted to do harm to Bill?
I don't really get all into Bill's business as far as, you know, who and what he knows.
Her demeanor and her attitude is just extremely odd to me. Something's not right.
30, what'd you do after when you got up today?
My normal. I got coffee, cigarette, and let's see, cleaning the house. I left the house and I went up to the Austin Storage Express. I went up there and then put a rug in. Oh, and I got bread over at the gas station.
Which one?
Right there, whatever is it, Circle K?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I bought bread and then went up there and I'm just driving around trying to get myself lost. I was doing a really good job of it too.
That just seemed odd to me. Why would you go buy groceries to take home and then go take a several-hour drive to try to get yourself lost? Is she trying to displace herself from the crime scene? We asked her, do you have anything that shows that you were at the Circle K at that time?
Take a receipt from there?
Actually, I don't know. Oh. There it is.
She's pretty quick to provide a receipt to verify her whereabouts at that time. So she did have an alibi, the time frame of Bill Reynolds' death.
We then asked, was you with anybody? She said, no, I was not with anybody.
Jonetta's alibi checks out, so police release her, even though they're still very suspicious.
We still want to verify her story, so we requested the surveillance footage from the storage facility and at the Circle K. And this is where the investigation started to take a major twist. We were able to verify through surveillance footage that Johnetta indeed was at the storage facility and at the Circle K on the date in question. But one thing she left out, she was not alone.
Investigators are piecing together Jonetta's movements on the day of Bill's murder.
We want to verify Jonetta's story. And that's when we really started to uncover that Johnetta was not being truthful with us. On the surveillance footage from the storage facility, Johnetta is met by another vehicle that has two young men in it. Why is a woman 40 years old hanging out at a storage facility with two young male individuals, half her age. Who are these guys? Why did she not want us to know who those two individuals were? They were taking items out of the storage unit, placing them into the vehicle. And then one of the male individuals obtains something from the passenger side and places it in her vehicle. That was extremely odd.
Janetta is supposed to be dropping off items at the storage facility when in fact she was taking them out. This raised suspicion. It really did.
In what would be considered a good break for law enforcement, the vehicle that was driven by the two young males was parked perfectly under a surveillance camera where a great shot of the license plate could be detected.
That plate came back to an individual named Jacob Mathis.
Oh. Okay. Do you know why you're here?
No.
You have any, no clue at all?
No.
Jacob did not seem to be comfortable being interviewed.
While you were at the storage facility, who was with you there? It was me, my roommate, and Mr. Okay.
We've now identified individuals that were associated with Johnetta on the day of Bill's death, and we need to know why they're with her.
And we came and got you for a reason, okay? But we need you to tell us who your roommate is.
He asked me not to give his name.
When Jacob Mathis refuses to give police information, even as something as simple as a name, investigators kind of start looking his way and thinking, okay, something's not adding up here.
How'd you get in the gate at the storage facility? Carrie called to get the code. Who's Carrie? I'm sorry.
Jacob accidentally slipped and said the name Carrie. And the fear on his face when he realized he'd done that really let us know that we're onto something here.
Carrie's my roommate.
What's his last name?
Heald.
There's a dynamic here that they want to conceal from us, and we need to know why. Carrie was located and brought in for questioning.
Okay. Sound right here for me.
Over there.
You probably wondering why you're here?
Yeah, a little bit.
He seemed like a guy that was not worried about being questioned by the police.
How old are you, man?
22. Don't be intimidated by all my piercings and stuff. I'm actually a really nice guy.
It doesn't intimidate anybody.
Initially, he denies being in Scott County on the date of Bill's murder. But when confronted with some of the stuff we saw on the surveillance footage, that's when the interview started to break down. He began to explain to us his relationship with Johnetta.
Just asked me if I wanted to make quick cash. She thought because I had tattoos and piercings that that's the kind of person I was.
Tell us what happened. Tell me what she said.
That if I would kill someone, she would give me money.
He revealed that there were several meetings that took place with Johnetta. When she asked him, what will it take to kill Bill Reynolds? To have a 20-year-old individual explain to you that he was hired to commit murder, it was very, very evil, twisted, and vile.
What were you supposed to get out of this?
A lot of money.
How much?
100,000.
100,000.
It didn't make sense. She was an over-the-road truck driver who seldom was home. Where on earth is Johnetta getting this kind of money?
We discovered Bill had an infatuation with NASCAR memorabilia, and he began an impressive collection. A lot of people have investments in stock. Bill's investment was NASCAR.
Anything NASCAR, I think the man has. I called him a hoarder of NASCAR.
There's a lot of money here. His collection was estimated to be worth in the hundreds of thousands of dollars.
You were gonna get $100,000 for that NASCAR stuff?
I was gonna help her sell them all.
I'm thinking there's no way. There's no way. For Bill's NASCAR collection to be the payment for someone to commit murder, unbelievable.
The one thing Bill loved the most in life was going to be the cause of his demise. It's so sad. It really is sad.
We learned that after the murder, Janetta Hall meets Carrie and Jacob at the storage facility. They're transferring the NASCAR items from the storage unit into their vehicle. They had agreed that they would share in the proceeds.
What kind of conversation took between you and Johnetta when you got to the storage facility?
She told me not to worry about it, just to get everything packed into the car. And then while we were packing it, she told me to move the gun to her car, that she would take care of everything else.
We have a murder now that had been planned, and everybody had a job. But we still need to know how they all knew each other.
That's when things get really weird. Carrie makes a revelation to investigators. He says he knows Janetta Hall through her daughter, his girlfriend, Amaris.
And this is a new development. Now we're starting to connect some dots.
My favorite, absolute favorite picture of him, to me, is just, that's Carrie. I might be biased, but I think he's a good-looking kid. In this picture, he's 21, and this was about the time that he started hanging out with Amaris and Johnetta. My first impression of her was she is not his type. When I met her, she was just trying to impress. I mean, she wasn't disrespectful. She didn't have a, snarl look, nothing like that. I mean, she was fine. I just looked at her as a fly-by-night. She was going to come and go and be gone. Boy, was I wrong.
During this interview, Carrie indicated to law enforcement that it wasn't just him and Jacob Mathis involved in this plot with Janetta Hall.
There was a fourth person involved. How many more turns can we take on this investigation? We're in the wee hours of the morning now, and it was important that we did not stop at this point because we just kept uncovering untruths and more information.
How much knowledge does Amaris have in this?
She knows that it happened.
She knows you pulled the trigger too.
Yeah.
I was like, wow. We realized that Amaris Bunyard was a lot more than just Jonetta's daughter and Carrie's girlfriend. Amaris Bunyard was also involved in this murder.
Can you imagine a mother and daughter murder duo? That's just crazy. It's outrageous.
We brought Amaris Bunyard in for an interview.
You need a water?
Oh, no, I'm perfectly fine. But thank you, though.
Cool. Okay. Why don't you tell us everything about this situation?
Amaris was very cooperative. She realized that we knew she was involved. And then she began to tell us exactly what happened.
Well, Mom asked me to tell Carrie and Jacob that she wanted to talk to him. She goes, I might need help handling Bill, and we might need him taken out.
I mean, there's a shock factor when you hear it.
At that point, I looked at her, And I said, okay, because I didn't know what else to say. I was kind of in shock.
She told us that several meetings took place at her apartment for the plannings of the murder.
I wanted to leave the meeting, but I felt like I was stuck and I was rooted there and I couldn't.
Amaris told me a lot about the fact that when she was growing up, her mom wasn't around. I mean, it always hurts. Feeling like you're not wanted by a parent.
If somebody who isn't around finally starts coming around and giving you attention, then you're more likely to give them things that they want.
We find out Johnetta provided the weapon, .38 special revolver. It was given to Amaris at Dalene's house, covertly.
She wrapped the gun up in a blanket and she handed it to me.
Johnetta gives Amaris the gun to commit the crime. It's a very twisted situation.
She goes, set that in your purse so your grandmother doesn't see. I thought that was weird, but I went with it.
Amaris took her purse then out to the car that her and Carrie were driving, and that's how Carrie obtained the firearm to kill Bill Reynolds.
Is it fair to say, though, that you were involved in getting the gun?
I was, and I feel like shit for it.
Okay. Why do you feel like shit over it?
He wasn't the same Bill that I knew, but he was my papa. The man was there my entire life.
Tell us what you were told.
You know, how Bill's changed. You know, how he turned into this monster.
Bill was made out to be an evil human being to Amaris by Johnetta. She had convinced her that this was what was needed to make their life better.
Bill was good to her. He really loved Amaris. I mean, he would do anything for that child. And it's sad, it's really sad.
It takes a disgusting human being, a very evil and twisted person, to use that sort of manipulation.
Johnetta had manipulated and groomed everyone involved to try to get them to see her side of things.
Carrie did talk about Johnetta a lot. And he was doing like different odd jobs for her. So I really didn't think anything of it. It was keeping him busy. As I was hearing more and more about Johnetta, I did ask him if there was something more between them because he talked about her so much.
It was apparent that Johnetta Hall was willing to do anything or say anything that she could to get someone to carry out this murder for her.
She swooped in to give him that attention that I wasn't giving him. And then she played on his emotions.
And how do you convince a 20-year-old to commit murder?
Johnetta told Carrie that Bill had sexually abused Amaris. That was a lie.
Carrie's very overprotective. The best way to get to him is to tell him that somebody he cares about is being hurt. And that is pretty well his kryptonite.
For Johnetta to say those kind of accusations and those be false just shows you the levels of what she would go to, you know, and how low she would get to get things done.
She picked young, impressionable people, including her own daughter, to manipulate, to do her dirty deeds.
But there's more to the story. There's a lot more to come. As the mayor's interview progressed, it was apparent that Johnetta Hall had reached a point of desperation.
According to Carrie, I was part of the contract that my mother told him I would marry him if this was done. I didn't think my mom would pretty much traffic me off like that.
What kind of monster would use their daughter as a ploy to get someone to commit murder?
It's sick.
I was kind of on autopilot. I was so used to just doing for her without thinking. I just did it. But inside, I felt like I was tearing myself apart.
The planning of this murder and all the meetings seemed to be the only way she could really bond with her mother.
I feel as though Amaris was trying to gain the approval of an absentee mother. It's shocking
to see a mom try to take her daughter down a road, a criminal road, a path that's so dark as this. It's very heartbreaking.
Well, we're finished here. We are going to arrest you today. Okay.
Her mother, Janetta, just played her and told her what to do, and she was basically just a puppet.
When taking this case to trial, I was extremely nervous because we didn't have a murder weapon.
After Carrie Heald put the murder weapon in the car of Janetta Hall, she went for a drive, just like she had told police. I believe that drive was to get rid of the murder weapon. She drove for quite a long time over many bodies of water, and that weapon was never discovered.
We're getting ready to put a person on trial for murder that was not at the crime scene, that didn't pull the trigger. We're missing some key elements here to be able to convince a jury that she's guilty of murder.
Anytime you've got a murder and all you have against your defendant is the testimony of other people who were involved in this crime, you're always worried.
In the courtroom, Janetta was straight-faced. I think in Janetta's eyes, the kind of manipulator that she was pretty much convinced that there's no way this jury's gonna find me guilty.
I mean, it took forever. I thought, man, this ain't never gonna happen.
But the jury saw through her and saw the actions and heard all the evidence and the testimony.
Janetta was found guilty by the jury of murder and conspiracy to commit murder and was given a sentence of life without parole.
I felt justice had been served. Janetta's exactly where she needs to be. But this case had a domino effect that affected multiple lives because of manipulation, because of greed, because of pure evil.
I know, I was in shock. I would have bet my house that he did not do it. That was not my son. My son would have never done anything like that. Just, I'm sorry. His whole adult life is, locked up in prison because of Janetta and Amaris. Due to lies, just lie after lie after lie. My son is, taken away. When you cannot protect your child and you see stuff going on with them, it is heart-wrenching.
He'd start laughing and make you laugh.
You ever walk into a room and you can tell something just isn't right?
There was sex parties, there was getting together with groups.
It's manipulation at its finest.
It was to please my mother. It was what she wanted done.
The headline hits the city like a sudden siren in the night. Sydney, 1994. Cold case solved. Family friend charged after 30 years. But long before those words ever exist, before anyone dares to whisper the word solved, there is only a quiet street near Parramatta. Sodium lights buzzing faintly above parked cars, and a front door that never opens again the way it should. It is winter, the kind of Australian winter that seeps into bone and silence. And inside the house, the clock keeps moving forward even though one life, at precisely 9:42 p.m., has already stopped. Neighbors will later say they heard nothing unusual, no scream, no crash, only the ordinary background noise of suburbia breathing in its sleep, a detail that will haunt detectives for decades because whatever happened inside that house was clean, contained, terrifyingly efficient. And when morning comes, the scene feels less like a crime and more like a question that refuses to answer itself. The victim is known, loved, woven tightly into the fabric of the community, the kind of person whose name appears on school newsletters and church rosters, whose face is instantly recognizable at the corner shop. There are family photos on the mantel, half-drunk tea cooling on the kitchen counter, a television left on mute, flickering blue across a wall that will soon be photographed from every angle. Police arrive just after sunrise, radios crackling low, notebooks already open, and the first officer through the door pauses because the air itself feels wrong, heavy, staged, as if the room is holding its breath. There are no obvious signs of forced entry, no smashed windows, no ransacked drawers. Whatever violence occurred here did not announce itself. It slipped in quietly, like someone who knew exactly where they were going. By midday, the street is sealed off with tape, yellow against gray asphalt, and the community gathers in clusters, arms folded, voices lowered, eyes darting toward the house, and then away again. Reporters arrive quickly, cameras hungry, microphones extended. The word shock already forming in headlines before investigators have even finished their first sweep. This is Sydney in the mid-90s, a city growing fast, confident, sunlit, and crimes like this are supposed to happen somewhere else, to someone else. Not here, not to one of their own. And yet the evidence does not care about reputation or geography. It sits silently in plastic bags, waiting for someone, someday, to understand what it is trying to say. Detectives move methodically, photographing footprints that lead nowhere, collecting fibers that look promising, and then dissolve into nothing under analysis, lifting fingerprints that belong only to the people who are supposed to be here. Friends are interviewed first, then neighbors, then co-workers, the same questions repeated again and again until voices grow hoarse. When was the last time you saw them? Did they mention anything unusual? Anyone new in their life? Anyone old who returned unexpectedly? The answers form a fog of routine and normalcy, a portrait of a life that by all outward appearances was not spiraling toward violence. That absence of motive becomes the first great wall investigators slam into, a smooth surface with no handholds, no cracks, just the blunt realization that this case will not give itself up easily. Then comes the detail that shifts the atmosphere, subtle but unmistakable. A name surfaces repeatedly in conversations, not as an accusation, not even as suspicion, but as familiarity. A family friend, someone trusted, someone who had been in the house before, who knew the rhythms, the shortcuts, the habits. At first it feels too ordinary to matter, almost comforting, because surely the person who brings casseroles and remembers birthdays cannot be the same person capable of ending a life. Detectives note the name anyway, writing it down with the same neutral pen stroke they use for everyone else, unaware that this ink will sit dormant in a file for 3 decades, waiting for science, persistence, and time to catch up. As weeks turn into months, the case grows colder, not dramatically, not with a single failed test or explosive revelation, but with a slow erosion of momentum. Leads dry up, witness memories soften and blur. Media attention shifts elsewhere. The house is eventually sold, repainted, lived in again by people who sense the history in the walls but do not fully know it. For the family left behind, time behaves differently. It stretches and warps, marked not by seasons or holidays, but by anniversaries of absence, by birthdays that feel incomplete, by the constant low hum of unanswered questions. They learn the language of police updates, the careful optimism, the phrases that sound hopeful but mean nothing concrete. Still working the case, still following leads, still no arrests. Inside police headquarters, the file grows thicker, then older, its edges softening with each passing year. Technology advances quietly in the background. DNA testing improves. Databases expand. Cold cases are reopened, revisited, reimagined. Occasionally, a detective pulls the Sydney 1994 file from the shelf, reads it late at night under fluorescent lights, tries to see what the original investigators might have missed. Each time, the same frustration surfaces. The crime scene was too controlled, the suspect pool too close, the answers too deeply buried beneath trust and time. And yet, the case never fully dies. It lingers in training rooms and quiet conversations, cited as an example of how familiarity can be a perfect camouflage. Younger officers hear about it from veterans who worked it early on, who still remember the smell of the house, the way the light fell across the floor that morning. They remember the family friend, too, the one who was questioned and released, questioned again, and set aside, not because they were cleared, but because there was nothing solid enough to hold on to. No weapon, no eyewitness, no forensic link strong enough to survive a courtroom. Suspicion alone is not justice. Suspicion alone cannot carry a charge. Years pass, decades. The city changes. Streets are renamed. Technology that once seemed futuristic becomes obsolete. And somewhere, living an ordinary life in plain sight, the family friend grows older. Just another face in a crowd, just another name that no longer makes headlines. Until one day, quietly without fanfare, a sample is retested. A comparison is run again, this time against a database that did not exist in 1994. The result does not shout. It does not celebrate. It simply matches. When the call comes, it feels unreal, even to the detectives who have waited so long for it. 30 years of silence collapse into a single moment of clarity, sharp and undeniable. The past, it turns out, has not forgotten. It has been patient. And as officers prepare to knock on a door, they have imagined countless times. The community that once stood stunned behind police tape has no idea that the story they thought had faded into history is about to return, louder, darker, and far more personal than anyone ever expected. The arrest does not happen with flashing lights or shouted commands. No dramatic chase through familiar streets, only a quiet knock and a name spoken aloud after 30 years of being unspoken. And when the door opens, the past finally steps into the present. The man standing there looks ordinary, smaller somehow than the shadow he has cast for decades, hair thinned by time, face lined with age, but the weight in the room shifts instantly because everyone involved understands what this moment means. A family friend, a trusted presence, a figure who once moved freely through that house in 1994, who shared meals and conversations, who knew where things were kept, who knew how to be invisible. The handcuffs click softly, almost politely, and in that sound echoes the collapse of a lie that has lasted longer than some lives. News spreads fast, faster than the original crime ever did, because this is not just an arrest, it is a rupture. Sydney wakes up to headlines that feel unreal, words arranged in a way no one quite expected to see. Cold case solved, family friend charged. And suddenly the community is pulled backward in time, forced to re-examine memories they thought were settled. People replay conversations in their heads, question smiles they once trusted, wonder how close they stood to something monstrous without ever seeing it. Shock ripples outward. From the family who has waited too long for answers to the neighbors who once told police they heard nothing, saw nothing, knew nothing. Inside the investigation rooms, detectives move carefully because solving a cold case is not a victory lap. It is a delicate excavation. Every step must be justified. Every conclusion must be anchored in evidence that can withstand not just scrutiny, but time itself. The DNA match is the spine of the case, the piece that finally gives structure to decades of suspicion, but it is not enough on its own. They reopen interviews, revisit timelines, reconstruct movements hour by hour, minute by minute, as if rewinding a tape that has degraded with age. Witnesses are older now. Some are gone. Others remember differently, or not at all. Memory, like evidence, degrades. The suspect's past statements are pulled from archives. Words spoken casually in the 90s now weighed with modern precision. Small inconsistencies begin to glow under this new light. Not dramatic lies, but subtle fractures. A time that doesn't quite align. A reason for being somewhere that no longer fits when cross-checked against newly uncovered data. Back then, these details were dismissed as human error. Now, they feel deliberate, intentional. The mask of familiarity, once comforting, now looks like camouflage. For the victim's family, the arrest is not closure. It is impact. It lands heavy and uneven, stirring grief that had settled into a fragile, livable shape. They are asked to remember everything again, to speak names aloud, to relive moments they had carefully sealed away. The man they once welcomed into their lives is now framed as the architect of their loss, and the betrayal cuts almost as deep as the crime itself. Trust, once broken this profoundly, leaves a scar that no verdict can erase. Court documents begin to circulate, stripped of emotion, reduced to facts and timelines, but the story behind them is anything but sterile. Prosecutors outline a theory that feels chilling in its simplicity: access, familiarity, opportunity. No forced entry because none was needed. No signs of struggle because the victim did not expect danger. Violence delivered quickly, decisively, by someone who knew how to move through the space without drawing attention. It is a narrative that fits too well, each piece clicking into place with an unsettling ease. Defense attorneys push back, as they must, pointing to the years that have passed, the possibility of contamination, the fragility of old evidence. They remind the court that memory is unreliable, that science evolves, that certainty is an illusion. It is a battle not just over guilt, but over time itself, over whether justice delayed can still be justice at all. The courtroom becomes a theater of contrasts, modern forensic language colliding with decades-old recollections, digital projections illuminating moments that occurred in an era of analog everything. Outside, the public watches closely because this case touches a nerve. It feeds a collective fear that the people closest to us are not always who they seem, that evil does not always announce itself with obvious signs. It sometimes arrives carrying gifts, sharing jokes, blending seamlessly into family gatherings. The idea is deeply unsettling, and it lingers long after the news cycle moves on, embedding itself in conversations and quiet moments of doubt. As the trial progresses, new details emerge, not all of them clean or satisfying. Investigators admit what they missed, what they couldn't prove, the dead ends they followed for years, while the real answer lived just out of reach. There is no attempt to rewrite history as flawless. Instead, there is an acknowledgement of limits of how far policing has come and how far it still has to go. Cold cases, by their nature, are stories of patience and failure as much as persistence and hope. The accused sits quietly through it all, expression carefully neutral, a man suspended between who he was believed to be and who he is now accused of being. Cameras catch every glance, every shift in posture, and analysts dissect these fragments endlessly, searching for meaning where there may be none. guilt and innocence are projected onto him in equal measure, depending on who is watching, because unresolved trauma invites interpretation, and certainty is a rare commodity. For the community, the case becomes a mirror. People look back at 1994 with new eyes, seeing not just a tragic event, but a lesson in how crimes can hide in plain sight, protected by familiarity and time. They remember the initial shock, the fear that briefly tightened its grip on the neighborhood, and how quickly normalcy returned once the threat seemed to vanish. Now, they understand it never really did. As the days in court stretch on, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Solving a cold case does not warm it. It exposes everything that is frozen beneath the surface. Grief preserved in amber, suspicion left unresolved, lives shaped by an absence that never stopped echoing. The arrest answers a question, but it also opens dozens more about motive, about silence, about how a person can carry a secret like this through an entire lifetime. And as the trial edges closer to its most critical moments, as arguments sharpen and the weight of 30 years presses down on every word spoken, the city holds its breath again, just as it did on that winter morning in 1994. This time, though, the silence feels different, heavier, charged with the knowledge that the past has finally caught up. And whatever the outcome, nothing will ever return to the way it was before the door opened and the name was spoken aloud at last. The prosecution begins to peel back the years layer by layer, not rushing, because haste is the enemy of credibility in a case this old, and every sentence spoken in court carries the weight of 3 decades. They start not with the murder itself, but with proximity, with charts and maps projected onto screens that did not exist when the crime occurred, showing how close the accused lived, how often he visited, how seamlessly his presence blended into the victim's daily life. Jurors listen as dates from the 1990s are spoken aloud, sounding distant and almost unreal, yet made immediate by photographs pulled from shoeboxes and albums, images of smiling faces taken months before everything stopped. The contrast is jarring and intentional. This case is not just about violence, it is about access. Witnesses take the stand one by one, voices wavering as they revisit memories long buried. A neighbor recalls seeing the accused car parked on the street that evening, a detail dismissed at the time because it seemed so normal. A co-worker remembers a casual remark made by the victim days earlier, something about feeling uneasy, without being able to explain why. At the time, it was brushed off as stress, nothing more. Now, it lands differently, reframed by what followed, heavy with implication. The defense objects frequently, pushing to keep speculation out, reminding the court that hindsight is a powerful and dangerous lens. Forensic experts follow, speaking in precise, clinical language about samples collected in 1994 and preserved through years of technological limbo. They explain degradation, contamination risks, chain of custody, each potential weakness addressed head-on before the defense can seize it. When the DNA evidence is presented again, slowly, methodically, it feels less like a revelation and more like a confirmation of something long suspected but never proven. The match is described in probabilities so extreme they verge on the abstract, numbers that mean little emotionally but everything legally. This is the moment the case pivots, the point at which doubt begins to thin. The defense counters with its own experts, challenging assumptions, raising alternative explanations, reminding jurors that certainty is often constructed, not discovered. They question whether the sample could have been transferred innocently, whether years of handling could have altered results, whether modern interpretation is being unfairly imposed on old data. It is unnecessary friction, and it slows the narrative, forcing everyone in the room to sit with uncertainty longer than they might like. Justice, the defense argues, cannot be retrofitted. Outside the courtroom, public opinion hardens and fractures at the same time. Some see the case as a triumph of persistence, proof that time does not protect the guilty. Others worry about precedent, about the danger of trusting science to reach backward and assign blame where memories have faded and alibis can no longer be verified. Talkback radio lights up. Opinion columns appear. The phrase cold case is repeated endlessly, stripped of its technical meaning, and repurposed as a symbol of both hope and fear. As testimony continues, the prosecution introduces a quieter but no less devastating element: behavior after the crime. Not dramatic confessions or sudden disappearances, but subtle shifts, a change in routine, a withdrawal from the family, a reluctance to engage when the investigation intensified. These details on their own are fragile. Together, they form a pattern that prosecutors argue reveals consciousness of guilt. The defense responds sharply, insisting that grief, fear, and community pressure can explain almost anything, and that interpreting behavior is a slippery slope toward bias. The victim's absence looms over every exchange, an invisible presence that shapes the room. Their name is spoken carefully, respectfully, never casually. When personal items are introduced into evidence, the courtroom stills. A jacket, a set of keys. Ordinary objects elevated to artifacts by tragedy. Family members sit rigid, eyes fixed forward, absorbing every word, every implication, knowing that no outcome can return what was taken, only redefine the story they have lived with for so long. Midway through the proceedings, a former detective takes the stand, one of the original investigators, now retired, voice rough with age and memory. He speaks about the limitations of the time, about gut feelings unsupported by proof, about suspects they could not pursue without risking the integrity of the case. He admits mistakes openly, decisions that haunt him still. It is not an attempt at absolution, but context. The past, he explains, was not incompetent, just constrained. Listening to him, it becomes clear how thin the line is between justice delayed and justice denied. The accused remains largely silent throughout, advised carefully, protected by process. When he does speak, it is brief, controlled, his words chosen with the precision of someone who understands what is at stake. Observers parse his tone endlessly, searching for cracks, for humanity, for something that might confirm what they already believe. But courtrooms are not built for emotional clarity. They are built for evidence. And evidence does not always satisfy the hunger for narrative resolution. As closing arguments approach, tension tightens. The prosecution paints a picture of inevitability, of a truth that waited patiently for technology and courage to align. They remind jurors that familiarity can be weaponized, that trust can be exploited, and that time, far from erasing guilt, can preserve it. The defense urges restraint, warning against the seductive simplicity of hindsight, against allowing a single strand of evidence to overshadow decades of ambiguity. When the jury finally retreats to deliberate, the silence left behind is profound. 30 years of questions now compressed into a single decision, 12 people tasked with carrying a burden that belongs, in some sense, to an entire community. Outside, cameras wait. Inside, families wait. The city waits. The cold case, once frozen in uncertainty, now hovers at the edge of definition, about to be transformed from mystery into verdict, from suspicion into history. And in that waiting, something shifts. The realization settles that whatever the outcome, this case has already changed the way the past is understood. It has reopened wounds, challenged assumptions, and forced a reckoning with the idea that justice is not a moment, but a process, slow and imperfect, shaped by the tools available and the courage to use them. As the jury weighs its decision, the story of Sydney 1994 presses forward, no longer silent, demanding to be heard in full, even if the answers it delivers are heavier than anyone hoped they would be. The jury room becomes a sealed chamber where decades collide, 12 people seated around a table scattered with notes, transcripts, photographs that smell faintly of age, and paper dust, each item a fragment of a life interrupted and a question deferred for too long. They speak carefully at first, voices low, aware that every opinion carries gravity. Time hangs over them like humidity, pressing in, reminding them that this is not just a decision about a man in front of them, but about whether the past can be judged fairly when so much of it has eroded. They return again and again to the same points: access, opportunity, DNA, circling them like cautious animals, testing their edges, asking whether they hold or crumble under pressure. In the courtroom, the wait stretches. Reporters refresh feeds. Family members sit with hands clasped so tightly their knuckles pale. The accused watches the door, expression unreadable, as if any display of emotion might be interpreted as confession or defiance. This is the strange theater of delayed justice, where silence becomes an event and stillness feels louder than argument. Outside, the city moves on. Buses run, shops open. People who were not yet born in 1994 go about their day, unaware that a verdict about that year may soon reshape how it is remembered. When the jury finally returns, the room shifts instantly, a collective intake of breath that ripples through benches and aisles. The foreperson stands, paper trembling just enough to betray the weight of it. The verdict is read aloud, each word measured, deliberate, and as it lands, it does not explode, it settles, heavy and irrevocable. Guilty. The word echoes in places it was never spoken before, filling gaps left by 3 decades of speculation. There is no outcry, no collapse, just a sharp intake of breath from the family, a subtle tightening of the accused jaw, a moment where everything stops moving. Sentencing follows weeks later, a quieter but no less significant chapter. The judge speaks about trust violated, about harm that radiates outward through families and communities, about the cruelty of a crime that hides behind familiarity. They acknowledge the passage of time, but do not allow it to soften the act. Age is not absolution. Delay is not forgiveness. The sentence is handed down, firm, final, a line drawn across 30 years of uncertainty. Cameras capture the moment, but they cannot capture what it feels like to finally hear consequences spoken aloud. For the family, relief and grief coexist uneasily. There is a sense of validation, of being believed after so long, but it comes paired with a resurgence of pain that feels almost new. Closure, they realize, is not a door that closes, but a room you learn to live in. They speak to reporters cautiously, voices steady but eyes betraying exhaustion, saying the words expected of them: justice, peace, gratitude, while privately grappling with the knowledge that nothing about this outcome restores what was taken. It simply ends the waiting. The community reacts in waves. Some feel vindicated, others unsettled. The idea that a trusted figure lived among them carrying such a secret forces a collective reevaluation of memory. People revisit old interactions, harmless moments now tinted with unease. They ask themselves how well anyone truly knows another person, how much darkness can hide behind familiarity without ever surfacing. It is a discomfort that lingers long after the headlines fade. Inside police circles, the case becomes a study. Seminars reference it. Training materials cite it. Detectives talk about patience, about the importance of preserving evidence, even when it seems useless, about humility in the face of unsolved crimes. They also talk about regret, about the years the family spent without answers, about what might have been different if today's tools had existed back then. Progress, they acknowledge, comes with its own kind of guilt, a reminder that justice is often constrained by the era that seeks it. The accused begins the next phase of life behind walls, his name now permanently linked to a crime that once existed only as rumor and file number. There are no interviews, no public statements, no attempt to explain. Silence returns, but it is a different silence now, bounded by certainty rather than doubt. Some interpret this quiet as acceptance, others as defiance. In truth, it no longer matters. The system has spoken, and its words carry finality. Years later, the case is still referenced, still remembered, but the tone shifts. It is no longer just a mystery, not just a cautionary tale about cold cases and forensic breakthroughs. It becomes a story about time, about how long truth can remain submerged and still resurface intact. It is cited when new cold cases are reopened, when families are told not to lose hope, when skeptics question whether justice delayed is worth the cost. Sydney 1994 becomes shorthand, a reminder etched into institutional memory. Yet even with a verdict, the story does not fully resolve. There are questions that will never be answered about motive, about what the accused told himself in the years that followed, about moments when he might have come close to being exposed and slipped away again. These unanswered pieces linger because human curiosity does not respect legal finality. The mind continues to probe the gaps, to imagine scenes that evidence cannot fill. On anniversaries, the family gathers quietly, no cameras, no statements, just remembrance. They speak the victim's name freely now, without fear that it will fade into a case number. The pain is still there, but it has changed shape, less sharp, more enduring. The city, too, remembers, though in a softer way, through occasional articles, through true crime podcasts that retell the story with dramatic flair, sometimes missing the quieter truths that lived inside it. And beneath all of it, the cold case leaves behind a legacy that is both reassuring and disturbing. Reassuring because it proves that answers can come even after decades. Disturbing because it confirms how easily violence can hide behind trust, how long it can take for truth to catch up. The solved label does not erase the chill that settles when people think about how close they were to something they never saw. As time moves forward again, carrying everyone with it, the story of Sydney 1994 settles into history, no longer unresolved, but never entirely at rest. It remains a reminder whispered through courtrooms and communities alike that the past is not done with us simply because we move on, that some truths wait patiently, and that when they finally surface, they do not bring warmth, only clarity, sharp, unyielding, and forever changed by the years they spent in the dark. Time does not stop after the verdict. It simply changes direction, flowing outward from the courtroom into lives that must now reorganize themselves around a truth they waited 30 years to hear. The legal chapter may be closed, but the psychological aftermath is only beginning, unfolding quietly in kitchens, bedrooms, long drives where the radio stays off. For the family, mornings arrive differently now. There is no longer the constant question of who did this, but in its place sits something heavier, the knowledge of how and by whom and how close that person once stood. Justice has a cost, and part of that cost is the permanent rewriting of memory. Old photographs are taken out again, not as evidence this time, but as anchors. The victim is reclaimed from headlines and court transcripts, remembered not for the way their life ended, but for how it was lived. Laughter, habits, small annoyances, private jokes, details that never made it into police files now feel essential acts of quiet resistance against being reduced to a case study. Yet even in these moments of remembrance, the shadow of betrayal intrudes. The family friend appears in the background of too many memories, a familiar face now impossible to separate from what he did. Time cannot untangle that knot. Within the community, conversations soften but do not disappear. People speak more carefully about trust, about intuition, about the subtle warnings they once ignored because they seemed impolite to acknowledge. There is a collective reckoning, not loud or dramatic, but deeply personal. Parents watch who their children spend time with. Neighbors think twice before dismissing unease as imagination. The case has implanted a quiet vigilance, an awareness that evil does not always arrive with warning signs, that it sometimes comes wrapped in normality. Law enforcement continues to dissect the case internally, not to celebrate, but to understand. Detectives debate whether anything could have been done differently, whether the arrest could have come sooner, whether a single decision in 1994 might have altered 3 decades of waiting. These discussions are not about blame, but responsibility. Cold cases, they acknowledge, are not just puzzles, they are promises made to families that the passage of time will not be an excuse for forgetting. The role of forensic science is examined closely. The DNA that finally broke the case open becomes both hero and cautionary tale. It demonstrates the power of preservation, of evidence carefully stored and never discarded. But it also highlights the fragility of relying on future breakthroughs. Technology can illuminate the past, but it cannot undo it. It can point to guilt, but it cannot restore lost years or ease the burden carried by those left behind. Science provides answers, not absolution. Media retrospectives emerge, polished and dramatic, framing the story as inevitable, as if the truth was always destined to surface. But those who lived through the long silence know better. There was nothing inevitable about it. There were years when the case gathered dust, when hope dimmed, when the idea of resolution felt almost cruel. The solved label, so clean and definitive, hides a messier reality, that justice is often uneven, dependent on chance, resources, and the slow march of progress. The convicted man becomes a subject of analysis, his life dissected in articles and documentaries, his ordinary routines scrutinized for hidden meaning. Psychologists speculate, commentators debate motive. Was it impulse or planning, rage or control? But speculation offers little satisfaction. The man himself remains largely silent, and in that silence, people project what they need to believe. Monsters are easier to understand when they look monstrous. This one does not, and that unsettles everyone. As years pass, the case begins to settle into institutional memory. It is cited when evidence rooms are audited, when funding for cold case units is debated, when new investigators are taught the importance of patience and humility. Sydney 1994 becomes a lesson, a reference point, a reminder that some truths move at a glacial pace. The story is told and retold, each time slightly reshaped by the teller, but the core remains unchanged, trust exploited, time stretched, truth delayed but not denied. For the family, anniversaries take on a different texture. There is no longer the ache of not knowing, but there is still loss, sharp and permanent. They mark the day quietly, sometimes together, sometimes alone, speaking openly now about the loved one they lost, refusing to let the crime be the defining feature of their memory. Healing, they discover, is not linear. It arrives in fragments, recedes, returns unexpectedly, triggered by a headline, a location, a familiar laugh overheard in public. The broader public gradually moves on, attention drawn to newer stories, fresher scandals, more immediate fears. But the impact of the case lingers in subtler ways, influencing how people perceive cold cases, how they respond when old investigations are reopened. There is more patience now, more willingness to believe that answers can come, even after decades. Hope, tempered by realism, replaces cynicism. And yet, beneath the reassurance, there is an unease that never fully dissipates. The realization that a crime can sit unresolved for so long, hidden behind everyday interactions, forces a confrontation with uncomfortable truths about human nature. It asks how many other answers are waiting, how many other familiar faces might one day be reinterpreted under the harsh light of evidence and hindsight. As the years continue to roll forward, the Sydney 1994 case remains a fixed point in time, a moment when past and present collided with undeniable force. It no longer asks who did it, but it continues to ask something equally unsettling. How well do we really know the people we trust, and how much of the truth can time hide before it finally gives way? Long after the cameras pack up and the courtroom empties for the last time, the case keeps speaking in quieter places, in the spaces where certainty does not bring peace so much as it brings reckoning. The city absorbs the outcome unevenly, like rain falling on concrete, some of it pooling, some of it running off, but all of it leaving a mark. Sydney does what cities do best. It moves forward, yet there are corners where 1994 still feels close, where the solved label does not fully settle the unease it stirred awake. The past has been named, but naming something does not always make it manageable. In private, people begin to ask harder questions, the kind that do not fit into headlines or court summaries. How many chances did he have to stop himself? How many times did he sit across from the family, offering sympathy, absorbing their grief, knowing exactly what he had done? The thought is corrosive because it reframes kindness as potential performance, familiarity as potential disguise. It forces an awareness that morality is not always legible on the surface, that evil can coexist with politeness for a very long time. Psychologists and criminologists dissect the case in academic journals and conference rooms, careful with their language but fascinated by the endurance of the secret. They talk about compartmentalization, about the human capacity to split lives into parallel tracks that never touch. They reference studies, patterns, probabilities, but even among experts, there is an undercurrent of discomfort. This case resists neat categorization. It is not impulsive enough to dismiss as a moment of madness, not demonstrative enough to frame as a life of violence. It exists in the unsettling middle ground where explanations feel thin. The prison intake process strips the convicted man of identifiers, replacing them with numbers and schedules, a ritualized erasure of the life he lived on the outside. Inside those walls, time compresses differently. Days are rigid, repetitive, stripped of choice. The contrast is stark. 3 decades of freedom after a single act, followed by confinement that arrives too late to feel corrective, too late to feel preventative. Justice in this form is less about balance and more about acknowledgement. The state is saying, finally, we see this now. For investigators, the emotional aftermath surfaces unexpectedly. Some feel relief, others a muted anger at the years lost, at the limits that once bound their work. They revisit old notebooks, margin notes written by younger versions of themselves, arrows pointing to possibilities that went nowhere. In those pages, there is a kind of archaeology, a record of effort that mattered even when it failed. The case reminds them that policing is not a straight line toward resolution, but a series of approximations, each one shaped by the era in which it occurs. Cold case units across the country take notice, not just of the success, but of the vulnerability exposed by the timeline. Evidence rooms are audited again. Preservation protocols are reinforced. Grants are requested, justified with references to Sydney 1994 as proof that patience can pay off, that investment in the forgotten can yield results no one expects. Families with their own unanswered questions watch closely, hope stirring alongside fear. For them, this case is both beacon and warning. The story seeps into popular culture, reshaped by podcasts and documentaries that favor tension over nuance. Voices lower, music swells, the narrative tightens, trimmed of uncertainty to fit an arc that feels satisfying. But those closest to it notice what is missing, the long stretches of nothing, the years where the case was not dramatic, just dormant, the boredom, the doubt, the quiet despair. These do not make good audio, but they are the true texture of waiting. At schools and community centers, discussions emerge about trust and awareness, framed carefully to avoid paranoia. The the message is subtle but clear. Vigilance does not mean suspicion of everyone, but it does mean listening to discomfort when it speaks. The case becomes a teaching tool, not in sensational terms, but as a reminder that prevention often lives in small, uncomfortable conversations, in questions asked early rather than answered late. For the victim's family, therapy becomes a space to renegotiate identity. For years, they were the ones waiting, the ones defined by absence and uncertainty. Now they must learn who they are without that question dominating every waking thought. Some find relief in advocacy, lending their voices to calls for better cold case funding. Others retreat from public attention entirely, choosing privacy as a form of healing. There is no single right response, only what allows them to breathe more easily. The name of the case continues to surface in unexpected moments, in legal arguments about admissibility, in debates about the reliability of old evidence, in conversations about whether there should be limits on prosecuting crimes after so much time has passed. Each time it is mentioned, it carries a quiet authority, the weight of a real outcome, a real sentence, a real family whose life was altered permanently. And beneath all of this, a deeper tension persists, unresolved and perhaps unresolvable. The idea that justice arrived, but not in time to matter in the ways people most want it to. The victim did not get to see it. The family did not get their years back. The community did not get the innocence it lost in 1994. What they got instead was truth, delivered late, sharp-edged, impossible to ignore. As nights pass and headlines fade, the case continues to cast a long, thin shadow, not dramatic, not loud, but persistent. It lingers in the understanding that some crimes do not end when they happen, that they stretch forward through decades, shaping lives quietly until something finally interrupts their trajectory. Sydney 1994 is no longer a question mark, but it is not a period either. It is a scar, visible if you know where to look, a reminder that time does not heal everything, and that sometimes all it does is wait. Even as the case settles into record books and reference lists, it continues to breathe, quietly influencing decisions made far from the original crime scene. Judges cite it when weighing the admissibility of old evidence. Legislators mention it in hearings about statutes of limitation, arguing over where mercy ends and accountability begins. The name Sydney 1994 drifts through these rooms like a low-frequency hum, rarely explained in full, because it no longer needs to be. Those who know, know. Those who don't can feel the gravity anyway. In the prison, routines harden into ritual. Lights on. Count. Meals slid through slots. Count again. Time, which once stretched indulgently for the convicted man, now folds in on itself, repetitive and narrow. There is no audience here, no performance to maintain. Whatever explanations he carries exist only in his own head, sealed away where no cross-examination can reach them. Other inmates know the basics, the headline version, and even among men accustomed to violence, there is a quiet distance kept. Crimes against trust, against familiarity, carry a different weight. They unsettle even those who have made peace with their own transgressions. Outside those walls, the family learns how to live without anticipation. For decades, every phone call carried potential, every update from police a flicker of hope or disappointment. Now the waiting is over, and the absence of that tension feels strange, almost disorienting. Some describe it as standing on solid ground after years at sea, legs unsteady, unsure how to move without the constant sway. Therapy sessions explore this strange aftermath, the guilt of relief, the fear of forgetting, the worry that moving forward somehow diminishes what was lost. The victim's name begins to surface in new contexts, attached to scholarships, memorial events, quiet acts of remembrance that emphasize life rather than loss. These gestures are not about erasing the crime, but about reclaiming narrative space. The story, for so long dominated by what happened in one terrible moment, slowly widens to include everything that came before. It is an act of defiance against reduction, against being remembered only for the worst thing that ever occurred. Among detectives, especially the younger ones who did not work the original investigation, the case becomes a touchstone for patients. They hear veterans speak about intuition constrained by evidence, about knowing something felt wrong, but lacking the tools to prove it. These conversations are not romanticized. They are pragmatic, sometimes bitter. The lesson is not that instinct is enough, but that discipline matters, that preserving what seems insignificant can change everything decades later. Evidence, they are reminded, is not just about today's case, but tomorrow's technology. The public, meanwhile, oscillates between fascination and fatigue. True crime audiences dissect timelines, freeze-frame old footage, debate theories long after the verdict. Some treat the story like a puzzle finally solved, others like a morality play with clear roles. Yet there is a growing discomfort with the consumption itself, a sense that turning real grief into entertainment carries its own ethical cost. The case sparks conversations about responsibility, about where storytelling ends and exploitation begins. In academic circles, the case is examined as an example of delayed moral reckoning. Papers explore the psychological burden of long-term secrecy, the stress of living a divided life, the cognitive strategies required to maintain normalcy under the weight of hidden guilt. Researchers argue over whether the passage of time dulls remorse or sharpens it, whether the mind adapts or corrodes. There are no definitive answers, only hypotheses built on fragments and inference. For the wider community, the most lasting impact is subtle. It appears in the way people listen a little longer when someone expresses unease, in the way institutions take allegations more seriously even when evidence is thin. The case does not create paranoia, but it does cultivate attentiveness. There is an understanding now that harm does not always announce itself loudly, that the absence of chaos does not mean the absence of danger. It is a lesson learned slowly, unevenly, but it persists. The original house, long since renovated, continues to exist as a normal place, occupied by people who did not choose its history. They know it, of course, in the abstract, the way one knows about events that happened before their time. But walls absorb memory imperfectly. Children play there. Meals are cooked. Life asserts itself, indifferent to the weight it carries. This, too, is part of the aftermath, the coexistence of ordinary joy with extraordinary violence, layered on the same physical space. Anniversaries pass with less public notice now, but not without meaning. The family marks them privately, sometimes together, sometimes alone. They have learned that grief does not require an audience, that remembrance can be quiet and still be complete. On these days, they speak about the loved one as if they were simply absent, away somewhere unreachable but not erased. The case may be solved, but the relationship continues, reshaped rather than ended. In court archives, the file is labeled closed, but the digital record remains active, accessed by students, lawyers, researchers. Each click is a small revival, a reminder that resolution does not equal disappearance. The system moves on, but it carries its old cases with it, shaping how new ones are approached. Sydney 1994 becomes a lens through which other cold cases are viewed, a reference point that tempers optimism with caution. As society debates the balance between forgiveness and punishment, the case is invoked again, this time as a moral example. Some argue that age should soften sentences, that a life largely lived without further violence should count for something. Others counter that the harm never stopped accruing, that every year without accountability compounded the original act. The arguments are passionate, unresolved, reflecting a broader struggle to define justice in human terms rather than legal ones. And through all of this, a quiet truth remains unchanged. The past does not stay put. It moves, reshapes itself, intrudes into the present when conditions allow. The Sydney 1994 case is no longer an open wound, but it is not fully healed either. It exists as a reminder that time can obscure, but it does not absolve, that familiarity can deceive, and that truth, when it finally surfaces, does not arrive gently. As the world continues to generate new stories, new crises, new mysteries, this one recedes slightly, taking on the muted tones of history. Yet for those who lived it, who waded through it, who were shaped by it, it remains immediate, personal, and instructive. A solved cold case, yes, but also a testament to how long consequences can stretch, and how deeply a single act can carve itself into the lives of strangers, binding them together across decades by a truth that refused to stay buried. With distance comes reinterpretation, and the Sydney 1994 case begins to shift again, not in facts, but in meaning. What once felt like an endpoint now looks more like a hinge, a moment where understanding pivots rather than settles. People who followed the trial closely start to notice how often the case resurfaces in conversations about trust, about patience, about the limits of knowing another human being. It becomes less about the man who was convicted and more about the environment that allowed him to remain unseen for so long. Silence, it turns out, is not just the absence of sound, but the presence of assumptions left unchallenged. In universities, law students analyze the transcripts line by line, noting how language evolves across decades, how the same act is described differently as cultural awareness shifts. Words like unlikely and inconclusive, once used to close doors, are now treated with suspicion. The case teaches them that legal certainty is not fixed, that it is negotiated continuously between evidence, interpretation, and the tools available at the time. Sydney 1994 becomes a lesson in humility, a reminder that confidence without proof can age badly. For forensic specialists, the case is cited whenever the topic of evidence longevity arises. They talk about storage temperatures, handling protocols, the ethics of retesting samples years later. The DNA that finally connected past to present is treated almost reverently, not as a miracle, but as a survivor. It endured neglect, technological stagnation, and skepticism, carrying its truth quietly until the moment someone knew how to listen properly. In that sense, the evidence becomes a metaphor, a symbol of how truth can persist even when ignored. The family continues to navigate a world that knows their story even when strangers do not know their names. They are recognized occasionally, approached with cautious sympathy, thanked for their strength by people who feel connected through distance. These interactions are strange, intimate without familiarity, reminders that their private pain has become public reference. Some days they accept this role, understanding its potential to help others. Other days they retreat, guarding their remaining privacy fiercely, because healing requires space as much as solidarity. The convicted man's appeals move quietly through the system, procedural and restrained, devoid of drama. Each filing reopens a small window of anxiety for the family, a reminder that legal closure is not always final. But the appeals are narrow, technical, focused on process rather than innocence. They do not challenge the core truth of the case so much as test its framing. Over time, they are denied, one by one, and with each denial the sense of permanence grows heavier. Public memory adjusts again. The shock dulls. The headlines fade. What remains is a distilled version of the story, often summarized in a sentence or two. Solved after 30 years. Family friend charged. Yet within that brevity lies an entire landscape of waiting, doubt, and endurance that cannot be compressed without losing its weight. Those who lived inside the story feel this loss acutely, the way nuance disappears when history is flattened for convenience. The case influences how communities respond to unresolved disappearances and unsolved murders. There is more pressure now, more insistence that cases not be abandoned simply because they resist resolution. Families advocate harder. Police departments allocate resources differently. The idea of a cold case, as a lost cause begins to erode, replaced by a quieter, more stubborn optimism. Answers may not come soon, but they are no longer assumed impossible. In conversations about morality, the case raises uncomfortable questions about redemption. Can a life lived quietly after a crime offset the harm caused? Does the absence of further violence matter? These debates rarely reach consensus, but they reveal something essential, that justice is not just about punishment, but about recognition. The Sydney 1994 verdict did not erase the years that followed the crime, but it reframed them, stripping away the illusion that they were neutral or benign. The original investigators, now mostly retired, watch this evolution with mixed emotions. Some feel vindicated, others regretful. They remember the constraints, the doubts, the nights spent staring at evidence boards that refused to resolve into clarity. Seeing the case now taught in classrooms and discussed in policy meetings feels surreal, as if their younger selves are being evaluated by a future they could not imagine. They accept this scrutiny as part of progress, even when it stings. The house, the street, the ordinary geography of the crime continue their quiet existence, largely untouched by the weight assigned to them. New residents learn the story gradually through whispers or internet searches, deciding for themselves how much significance to attach to it. Most choose to live forward, not backward. This, too, is a kind of resilience, the insistence that places do not belong forever to the worst thing that happened within them. On a broader scale, the case feeds into a cultural shift toward patience with complexity. It resists the clean moral arcs people crave, offering instead a long, uneven narrative where justice arrives late and leaves unanswered questions in its wake. It teaches that resolution does not always feel triumphant, that sometimes it feels solemn, even mournful. The truth, when it finally surfaces, can weigh as much as it liberates. As years continue to pass, Sydney 1994 occupies a strange middle ground between history and warning. It is old enough to feel distant, recent enough to feel relevant. It lives on in footnotes and memories, in lectures and quiet reflections, shaping how people think about trust, time, and accountability. The cold case is solved, the record closed, yet its influence continues to ripple outward, subtle and persistent. And in that persistence lies its final power, not in the shock of the arrest or the drama of the trial, but in the slow, enduring realization that some truths do not announce themselves with urgency. They wait, they endure. And when they finally emerge, they do not simply answer a question. They change the way all the other questions are asked. By the time the case reaches its 30th anniversary, the language around it has softened, but the gravity has not. What was once breaking news is now referenced, almost casually, folded into timelines and retrospectives. Yet for those who know the story in full, the anniversary feels heavy, charged with a sense of duration rather than distance. 30 years is long enough for a crime to feel historical, but not long enough for its impact to fade. The number itself becomes symbolic, a measure not just of time past, but of time lived under the shadow of uncertainty. In court records and media summaries, the case is often reduced to a sequence of events, stripped of texture, streamlined for clarity. But clarity, in this context, is deceptive. It suggests a straight line from crime to consequence, when the reality was anything but. The intervening years were not empty space. They were crowded with waiting, with assumptions solidifying into beliefs, with lives built around the absence of answers. The solved label cannot capture that density. It cannot communicate how long a question can shape behavior, decisions, identity. For the family, the anniversary prompts reflection rather than ceremony. They look back not just at the loss, but at who they were then, younger, more hopeful, less cautious. They recognize how the unanswered question shaped them, how it influenced careers chosen, relationships approached, risks avoided. The arrest did not undo that shaping. It simply made it visible. In acknowledging this, they begin to understand that justice did not arrive as a correction, but as a confirmation of what they had already lived through. The broader public engages differently now. Discussions about the case tend to focus on systems rather than individuals, on what it reveals about investigative limits, forensic evolution, and institutional memory. There is less appetite for villain narratives, more interest in structural questions. How many other cases sit waiting for the right moment? How many truths depend not on guilt or innocence, but on timing? The Sydney 1994 case becomes a lens through which people examine patience as a civic virtue, not just a personal one. In police academies, instructors pause longer on this case than on others. They emphasize not the dramatic breakthrough, but the years before it, the discipline required to preserve evidence without knowing whether it would ever matter. Cadets are told that most of their work will not end in clear resolution, that success is often invisible, measured in preparation rather than outcome. The case is used to instill a kind of professional humility, an understanding that justice is collaborative across generations. The convicted man's life inside the system settles into routine anonymity. His name appears less frequently in the press, his story overshadowed by newer cases, fresher controversies. Yet, his existence remains a quiet reminder that accountability can arrive after a lifetime of ordinary living. There is something unsettling in that ordinariness, in the idea that a person can pass through decades without consequence, only to be confronted by the past when it seems most distant. It complicates simplistic ideas of punishment and deterrence. Public discourse occasionally revisits the question of remorse. Did he feel it? Did he carry guilt or suppress it? Without confession, these questions remain unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. They persist because people want moral symmetry, a sense that inner reckoning accompanied external judgment. But the case offers no such reassurance. It suggests instead that accountability does not require emotional transparency, that justice operates independently of what a person feels or claims to feel. The case also reshapes how disappearance and silence are interpreted. In other investigations, when years pass without resolution, families and investigators now cite Sydney 1994 as evidence that silence does not equal emptiness. It may simply mean that the necessary conditions have not yet aligned. This perspective does not eliminate pain, but it reframes it, transforming waiting from passive suffering into active endurance. Hope becomes quieter, less dramatic, but more resilient. For journalists who covered both the crime and the trial decades later, the case stands out as a lesson in narrative responsibility. They reflect on how early coverage framed the victim, the neighborhood, the investigation, often relying on assumptions that later proved incomplete or wrong. Some acknowledge the harm caused by speculation, by the pressure to fill gaps with theory. In hindsight, the case illustrates the ethical cost of urgency, the way speed can distort truth. The physical artifacts of the case, once locked away, are now archived digitally, accessible with a few clicks. Photographs, transcripts, forensic reports exist in databases that did not exist when the crime occurred. This accessibility creates a strange intimacy, allowing strangers to engage deeply with a story that is not theirs. It raises questions about ownership, about who gets to interpret pain once it becomes public record. The family navigates this landscape carefully, aware that visibility can educate but also intrude. As cultural attitudes shift, the case begins to be cited in discussions about restorative justice, not as an example of its success, but as a challenge to its limits. What restoration is possible after 30 years? What repair can address decades of absence? These conversations do not produce easy answers, but they underscore a growing recognition that justice is not monolithic, that it contains competing values that must be balanced rather than resolved. Through all these reinterpretations, one element remains constant: the sense that the case refuses to be neatly concluded. Even with a verdict, even with a sentence, it continues to provoke reflection rather than satisfaction. It asks people to sit with discomfort, with the idea that some harms reverberate beyond legal resolution, shaping attitudes, systems, and expectations long after the gavel falls. As the years continue to accumulate beyond that 30th mark, the Sydney 1994 case settles into a paradoxical state. It is finished yet ongoing, closed yet instructive, solved yet still unsettling. It stands as proof that time can both conceal and reveal, that truth can arrive late without losing its force, and that the stories we tell about justice must be flexible enough to accommodate complexity, endurance, and the quiet persistence of unanswered emotional questions. As the case drifts further from the moment of verdict and deeper into collective memory, it begins to function less as a story and more as a reference point, invoked quietly when other investigations stall, when families are told there is nothing new to report, when files are marked inactive but not forgotten. Sydney 1994 becomes shorthand for a particular kind of endurance, a reminder passed between people who understand that resolution is not always tied to effort, but to alignment of tools, of timing, of courage to look again at what was once set aside. Within the justice system, the case subtly alters tone. Prosecutors speak more cautiously about certainty. Investigators are slower to close doors completely. There is an increased awareness that today's limitations may be tomorrow's blind spots, that dismissing a lead as unlikely can echo for decades. The case teaches restraint not as hesitation, but as humility, a recognition that the absence of proof is not the same as proof of absence. Families involved in other cold cases often reference Sydney 1994 when advocating for continued attention. They do so not because it promises answers, but because it legitimizes waiting. It validates the belief that persistence is not denial, that holding on to the possibility of truth is not foolish optimism. For some, the case becomes a psychological lifeline, evidence that the long arc of uncertainty does not always end in silence. The cultural appetite for true crime continues to grow, but the way stories like this are told begins to shift. There is more emphasis on aftermath, less on spectacle, more space given to the years between crime and consequence, to the way unresolved harm infiltrates ordinary life. Sydney 1994 is often cited as an example of why these middle years matter, why they deserve attention rather than compression. The story resists bingeable neatness. It insists on duration. In academic discussions, the case contributes to a broader understanding of moral time. Philosophers and legal theorists debate whether justice delayed loses legitimacy, or whether legitimacy is strengthened by persistence alone. Sydney 1994 complicates these debates, offering no clear answer, only a lived example where delay neither erased guilt nor fully satisfied those harmed. It suggests that justice is not a singular moment, but a process that unfolds unevenly, sometimes painfully, across generations. For the family, life settles into a quieter rhythm. The public attention has faded enough to allow anonymity again, but not so completely that the past disappears. They carry the knowledge forward, integrating it into their sense of self rather than fighting against it. There is strength in this integration, a refusal to let the crime remain an open wound. Healing, they discover, is less about closure than about coherence, about making space for truth without letting it dominate every corner. The city itself absorbs the story into its layered history. New scandals, new tragedies rise and fall, yet the memory of Sydney 1994 remains available, ready to be recalled when needed. It is referenced in policy discussions, in training sessions, in quiet conversations between professionals who understand its significance. The case does not haunt the city, but it instructs it, shaping a more cautious, attentive civic consciousness. Inside the prison system, the convicted man ages into obscurity, another file, another number, his story no longer exceptional within those walls. This ordinariness is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of all, the way an act that once shattered a community eventually blends into institutional routine. It challenges the assumption that punishment alone can contain the moral weight of a crime. Consequence, the case suggests, is not the same as comprehension. As technology continues to evolve, new tools emerge that promise to unlock other frozen cases. Artificial intelligence, expanded databases, predictive analytics, each advancement carries echoes of Sydney 1994, reminders of what becomes possible when patience meets innovation. But alongside optimism, there is caution. The case warns against overconfidence, against assuming that technology can replace judgment, empathy, or ethical restraint. The story also influences how silence is interpreted. Where once a lack of evidence might have been seen as the end of inquiry, there is now greater willingness to sit with uncertainty, to allow questions to remain open without abandoning them. This shift does not guarantee answers, but it preserves the possibility of them. Sydney 1994 becomes an argument for endurance over impatience, for listening even when nothing seems to be speaking. As the decades continue to stack quietly on top of one another, the case settles into a final, uneasy truth. It did not restore balance. It did not erase harm. It did not deliver catharsis. What it did was interrupt forgetting. It forced recognition where there had been silence, accountability where there had been familiarity, and reflection where there had once been complacency. And in that interruption lies its lasting significance, not as a triumphant resolution, but as a reminder that time is not neutral, that it shapes justice as much as it delays it. The Sydney 1994 cold case stands as evidence that truth can survive neglect, that patience can outlast denial, and that when answers finally arrive, they do not close the story, they change the way it is remembered. The final chapter of the Sydney 1994 cold case does not arrive with certainty or relief, but with a quieter, heavier understanding that some stories never truly end. They only lose their headlines and sink into the background noise of everyday life, where they continue to echo for those who know how to listen, long after the courtroom emptied and the cameras moved on. The case lingered in the spaces no verdict could reach, in the pauses between conversations, in the streets where nothing outwardly marked what had once happened there, in the private thoughts of people who still measure time as before and after. For the community, the word solved never fully settled. It hovered, uneasy, as if afraid to touch the ground. People accepted it publicly, repeated it when asked, but privately many felt the familiar pull of doubt. Not doubt about guilt, not doubt about the evidence, but doubt about completeness. The sense that something essential had slipped through unnoticed, that the truth, while legally sufficient, might still be emotionally unfinished. Cold cases, they learned, do not thaw all at once. Some parts remain frozen no matter how long the sun stays out. The original crime scene, now indistinguishable from its surroundings, continued to exert a quiet gravity. New buildings rose, old ones were renovated, foot traffic changed, but the air itself seemed to remember. Those who walked past without knowing felt nothing. Those who knew felt it immediately, a tightening in the chest, a faint sense of intrusion, as though stepping into a room where an argument had ended but the tension had not dissipated. Memory does not need markers to survive. Within the investigative community, Sydney 1994 became a case study not in triumph, but in restraint. It was cited as proof that persistence can yield results, but also as a warning that results do not erase responsibility. Officers who had once believed their role ended at arrest began to speak differently about their work. They talked about impact instead of outcome, about stewardship of truth rather than ownership of it. The case taught them that solving a crime is not the same as repairing what it breaks. The family learned to live with a dual reality. In one, there was a name, a charge, a sentence, a narrative the world could understand and move on from. In the other, there was still absence, still unanswered questions, still moments when the past intruded without invitation. They stopped expecting closure. Instead, they cultivated endurance. They allowed grief and relief to coexist without demanding that one cancel the other out. This balance became their quiet victory. Years later, when new cold cases surfaced in headlines, Sydney 1994 was often mentioned in passing. A reference point, a reminder. If that case could be solved, reporters would say, then perhaps this one can too. But those closest to the story understood the flaw in that comparison. What happened in Sydney was not a template. It was an exception shaped by specific timing, specific evidence, specific courage. Hope, they knew, could not be standardized. The convicted man's name gradually disappeared from public conversation. Without attention, he became what the system had always treated him as: a problem contained, a risk neutralized, a story archived. Yet the ordinariness of this disappearance was unsettling. It revealed how easily even the most devastating acts can be absorbed into routine, how punishment can conclude without comprehension, how society can file away horror once it no longer demands immediate response. For journalists who covered the case, there was a lingering discomfort. Many revisited their original reporting and noticed what they had missed, the small details overlooked in favor of speed, the assumptions repeated without challenge, the silences left unexplored. Sydney 1994 changed how some of them worked. It made them slower, more skeptical, less willing to accept neat narratives. The case had taught them that truth is rarely loud when it first appears. In classrooms and training rooms, the case was dissected again and again. Students debated ethics, evidence, memory. They asked whether justice delayed could still be justice at all, whether a system built on finality could ever accommodate uncertainty. No consensus emerged. Sydney 1994 resisted resolution even in theory. It existed as a contradiction, solved yet unresolved, concluded yet ongoing, finished yet unfinished. As time stretched on, the case took on a different function. It became a mirror. Each generation that encountered it saw their own concerns reflected back about trust in institutions, about the reliability of memory, about the cost of waiting. The story adapted without changing, its meaning shifting as the world around it did. That adaptability ensured its survival. In quiet moments, members of the community still asked themselves what might have happened if someone had spoken sooner, looked closer, refused to accept the easy explanation. These questions had no productive endpoint, but they persisted anyway. They were not accusations so much as reminders that responsibility is collective, that silence is never neutral, that familiarity can be a powerful disguise. The Sydney 1994 cold case ultimately leaves behind no clean moral, no comforting lesson. What it offers instead is a warning and an invitation. A warning about complacency, about the danger of certainty untested by time. And an invitation to remain attentive, to question conclusions, to understand that truth often moves at a pace that defies impatience. When the story finally fades from conversation altogether, as all stories eventually do, it will not be because it has lost relevance, but because its influence has been absorbed. It will live on in changed procedures, in altered instincts, in the quiet resolve of those who refuse to let unanswered questions disappear simply because they are inconvenient. And somewhere in Sydney, in a city that has learned to carry this weight without collapsing under it, the past remains present, not as a spectacle, but as a shadow, a reminder that cold cases are never just about what happened once, long ago. They are about what continues to happen afterward, in memory, in silence, in the long, uneasy space between knowing and understanding. By the time the story stretches into what could only be called an aftermath, the Sydney 1994 cold case has slipped almost entirely out of public language and into something more diffuse, more intimate, a low-frequency hum beneath the city's normal rhythms. It is no longer cited by name as often. Instead, it reveals itself in behavior, in the way investigators hesitate before dismissing a witness, in the way families insist on keeping files alive, in the way silence is no longer automatically equated with innocence or irrelevance. The case has become less a narrative and more a reflex. There are moments when it resurfaces unexpectedly. A retired detective asked during an unrelated interview about the case that changed his career pauses longer than necessary before answering, as if deciding how much of the truth can be safely spoken aloud. He talks about instincts ignored, about how familiarity dulls suspicion, about how the most dangerous assumption is that evil must look foreign. He does not say the name. He does not need to. Anyone who knows, knows. In certain neighborhoods, the year 1994 still carries a charge. Longtime residents remember the way doors locked earlier, the way conversations lowered in volume, the way trust thinned almost overnight. Younger residents sense only fragments of this history, half-heard stories that feel unfinished. They inherit the unease without understanding its origin, absorbing it as atmosphere rather than fact. This is how unresolved trauma survives, not through detail, but through tone. The evidence that once reignited the case now rests in climate-controlled storage, cataloged, preserved, inert. Its power was never in its physical form, but in timing. Had it been understood earlier, it might have changed everything. Understood later, it might have changed nothing. That narrow window, that fragile alignment, becomes one of the case's quiet obsessions. It underscores how justice often depends not on discovery alone, but on readiness, institutional, cultural, human. Legal scholars occasionally return to Sydney 1994 when discussing the ethics of finality. They argue over whether a case can ever truly close if its consequences continue to unfold. Some insist closure is a legal necessity, a boundary that allows systems to function. Others point to this case as evidence that such boundaries are artificial, that truth does not recognize procedural endpoints. The debate remains unresolved, much like the emotional ledger of the crime itself. For those who lived closest to the center of it all, memory begins to blur at the edges. Specific dates fade. Exakt Wurzeln Lust. What remains is sensation, the shock of recognition, the slow burn of waiting, the weight of knowing that certainty arrived too late to prevent anything, only late enough to explain it. This blurring does not weaken the story. It humanizes it. It strips it of spectacle and leaves only impact. Occasionally, someone new stumbles upon the case late at night through an article, a documentary, a passing reference. They consume it quickly, efficiently, in the way modern audiences consume tragedy. For them, it is compelling, disturbing, finite. For those who lived it, this efficiency feels almost violent. It highlights the gap between experience and representation, between living through time and skimming across it. The phrase cold case itself begins to feel inadequate. Cold implies stillness, dormancy, something waiting to be warmed. Sydney 1994 was never still. It moved quietly through years and relationships, reshaping them subtly, persistently. It was not frozen so much as submerged, existing below the surface where pressure is constant and visibility limited. In institutional memory, the case leaves behind policies and protocols, small adjustments that seem mundane until one realizes why they exist. A box to be checked, a review to be scheduled, a second opinion required. Each is a residue of the past, a safeguard built from regret. The system does not acknowledge this origin explicitly, but it does not forget it either. There is a temptation, with enough distance to romanticize endurance, to frame the long wait for answers as noble or necessary. Sydney 1994 resists this framing. It insists on the cost. It reminds anyone paying attention that waiting extracts something every year: energy, hope, clarity. The eventual emergence of truth does not refund these losses. It only contextualizes them. As the city continues to change, absorbing new residents, new stories, new crises, the case recedes further into the background. But it never disappears entirely. It survives in posture, in caution, in the slight tightening of procedures that might otherwise seem excessive. It survives because forgetting it completely would require undoing the lessons it forced into existence. In the end, the Sydney 1994 cold case does not ask to be remembered as extraordinary. It asks to be remembered as instructive, as proof that certainty is fragile, that familiarity can conceal danger, that time is both an obstacle and an accomplice. It stands as a quiet argument against complacency, whispered rather than declared. And so the story continues, not as a headline, not as a warning shouted into the void, but as a presence, subtle, persistent, unfinished in all the ways that matter. A reminder that some cases do not end when the facts are known, but only when their echoes finally fade, and even then, only if no one is listening. Long after the last official document is signed and archived, after the final appeal window closes, and the language of the law declares the matter settled, the Sydney 1994 cold case continues its quiet work in places no institution can reach. It lives in instinct, in hesitation, in the way people look twice at what once felt familiar. Its legacy is not loud, not ceremonial, but deeply ingrained, threading itself through decisions made years later by people who may not even remember where the instinct came from. There are nights when the city feels unusually still, when the noise drops just enough for memory to surface. On those nights, the past does not arrive as images, but as sensations, a tightening in the air, a sense of being watched by something without eyes. Those who lived through the original shock recognize this feeling immediately. It is the echo of a time when certainty collapsed, when safety proved conditional, when the ordinary revealed its capacity for harm. In police training rooms, the case is no longer presented in full. It appears in fragments. A paragraph here, a hypothetical there, a question posed without context. What would you do if the suspect was someone everyone trusted? The trainees answer carefully, academically. Only later do they learn that this was not a thought experiment, but a real failure once made, a hesitation that allowed time to pass unchecked. By then, the lesson has already taken root. The surviving records of the early investigation read differently now. What once seemed thorough now reveals gaps shaped by assumption. Notes that appear neutral carry the weight of bias. Decisions framed as practical reflect deeper discomforts, the reluctance to disrupt social harmony, the fear of accusing someone who belonged. Sydney 1994 exposes these patterns without accusation, simply by surviving long enough for them to become visible. For the family, anniversaries no longer arrive with the same sharpness, but they never arrive empty either. Each year adds distance, without diminishing significance. The loss does not shrink, it changes shape. It becomes quieter, more integrated, less disruptive, but no less present. They stop marking time by what might have been and begin marking it by what still is, the absence that persists regardless of explanation. There are moments of unexpected anger, not at the perpetrator, whose role feels almost abstract now, but at the years themselves, at the delay, at the knowledge that truth existed long before it was acknowledged. These moments pass without resolution, but they leave behind a clarity that grief alone could not provide. The understanding that injustice is often not a single act, but a sequence of small omissions compounded by time. The media, when it revisits the case at all, struggles with this complexity. Headlines prefer finality. Narratives demand arcs. But Sydney 1994 resists compression. It refuses to be reduced to a lesson neatly summarized at the end of a segment. Each attempt to simplify it strips away something essential: the duration, the waiting, the psychological toll of not knowing whether the world has already decided to move on without you. Among criminologists, the case fuels ongoing debate about the nature of truth in long-dormant investigations. Memory degrades, evidence decays, context shifts, and yet sometimes clarity still emerges. Sydney 1994 challenges the assumption that time only erodes. It suggests that time also reveals, not by preserving facts, but by altering perspective. What was once unthinkable becomes obvious. What was once dismissed becomes central. The city's younger generation encounters the story indirectly, through policies that feel overly cautious, through warnings that seem excessive, through a cultural emphasis on vigilance that feels inherited rather than earned. They do not resent it. They accept it as normal. And in that acceptance, the case achieves a strange form of resolution, not through forgetting, but through normalization of its lessons. In private conversations, some still ask the forbidden question: could it have been stopped sooner? The question has no productive answer, yet it persists. It lingers because it speaks to responsibility without assigning blame, to a collective discomfort that cannot be resolved by punishment alone. Sydney 1994 makes room for this discomfort without offering relief. It allows the question to exist unanswered. As years accumulate, the story becomes less about the crime and more about the gap it exposed between appearance and reality, between trust and scrutiny, between knowing and choosing to know. That gap, once revealed, never fully closes. It becomes part of how the community understands itself, a flaw acknowledged rather than denied. The convicted man's silence in later years adds another layer of unease. No confession that satisfies. No explanation that clarifies motive. Just absence. This silence mirrors the long quiet that preceded his arrest, reinforcing the unsettling symmetry of the case. What was withheld at the beginning remains withheld at the end. Sydney 1994 ultimately occupies an uncomfortable space between resolution and rupture. It closes one chapter while leaving others permanently open. It answers the question of who, but not the deeper question of how such certainty was delayed for so long. That second question has no courtroom, no sentence, no official reckoning. And so the case endures not as a solved mystery, but as a living reminder that justice is fragile, that truth is patient, that time does not heal all wounds. It simply teaches people how to carry them. As the story moves further away from the moment of revelation and deeper into lived time, the Sydney 1994 cold case begins to feel less like an event and more like a condition, something embedded into the way the city thinks, reacts, remembers. It no longer announces itself. It does not need to. Its influence is quiet, habitual, present in the reflex to double-check, to hesitate, to question what once would have passed without comment. There are places where the past presses closer than others. A street corner where nothing appears out of place. A house that has changed owners more than once. A park where children play, unaware of the invisible boundary they cross. These locations carry no plaques, no warnings, yet they retain a subtle gravity. People who know the story feel it immediately. Those who do not still sense something unresolved, a faint disruption in the ordinary flow of things. The city has learned to live with these soft fractures. In the years since the case was declared solved, investigators occasionally return to the original files, not in search of new answers, but to understand old failures. They read transcripts differently now. What once felt inconclusive now feels avoidant. What once seemed neutral now reveals fear. Fear of being wrong, fear of consequences, fear of challenging the familiar. Sydney 1994 becomes a study in how institutions protect themselves, sometimes at the expense of those they exist to protect. The family's relationship with the truth continues to evolve. At first, answers felt like an intrusion, reopening wounds they had learned to survive without explanation. Later, those same answers became anchors, something solid in a sea of uncertainty. Over time, even that solidity softens. Truth does not dominate their days, but it never fully recedes either. It occupies a middle space, acknowledged, respected, but no longer interrogated. There is a particular cruelty in delayed certainty. Knowing what happened does not return what was lost. It does not restore the years shaped by waiting, by suspicion, by unanswered questions. The case makes this cruelty visible without exaggeration. It refuses the comfort of redemption arcs. It insists that some losses are permanent, even when justice arrives. In public discourse, the word closure appears less frequently now, used with caution or avoided altogether. Sydney 1994 exposed its hollowness. Closure implies an ending that experience rarely delivers. What the case offers instead is recognition of harm, of failure, of endurance. Recognition becomes the closest thing to resolution, a quieter but more honest conclusion. Those who worked the case in its later years speak about it differently than those who were there at the beginning. The newer voices emphasize method, patience, restraint. The older ones carry regret between their words, pauses heavy with things left unsaid. The overlap between these perspectives is where the case truly lives, in the tension between intention and outcome. The story also alters how suspicion is understood. Trust, once considered a protective factor, is now viewed with more complexity. Sydney 1994 teaches that proximity can conceal as effectively as it can reveal. That danger does not always announce itself. That familiarity can be both comfort and camouflage. These lessons spread quietly, reshaping social instincts without demanding paranoia. As years pass, the emotional temperature of the case cools, but it never reaches neutrality. There is still heat beneath the surface, a reminder that harm does not expire simply because time advances. The community learns to hold this heat without being consumed by it, to acknowledge its presence without allowing it to define every interaction. The convicted man's continued silence becomes less infuriating and more emblematic. It underscores a central truth of the case. Explanation is not guaranteed. Motive may remain unknowable. Understanding may always be partial. Sydney 1994 challenges the expectation that every story ends with clarity. Sometimes the most honest ending is ambiguity. In moments of reflection, some realize that the case changed them in ways they never consciously noticed. They are slower to judge, less eager to conclude, more attentive to what feels slightly wrong. This change is subtle, cumulative, impossible to trace to a single source, and yet it leads back here again and again. The case no longer needs to be told in full to have impact. A reference is enough. A date, a phrase, that cold case. The weight is understood without elaboration. This shared understanding becomes part of the city's unspoken language, a shorthand for caution, humility, and persistence. As the narrative stretches toward what might resemble an ending, it becomes clear that Sydney 1994 was never just about solving a crime. It was about confronting the limits of certainty, the cost of delay, the danger of assumption. It was about learning that justice is not a moment, but a process shaped as much by what is ignored as by what is pursued. And in that realization, the story settles into its final, uneasy form. Not resolved, not forgotten, but carried forward. A shadow that no longer frightens, yet never disappears. A reminder that some truths arrive late, and when they do, they ask not for celebration, but for reflection. By the time the case reaches this far into the future, the Sydney 1994 cold case has stopped feeling like history and started behaving like atmosphere. It surrounds rather than confronts. It informs rather than interrupts. People no longer speak about it as something that happened, but as something that changed how things happen. The shift is subtle, almost imperceptible, but once noticed, it cannot be unseen. The city has grown older since then, louder in some places, quieter in others. Streets have been renamed, skylines reshaped, communities reorganized. Yet beneath the surface of renewal, the same unease still pulses, faint but persistent. It emerges in moments of hesitation. A parent pausing before trusting too easily, a neighbor noticing a detail they might once have ignored, an investigator refusing to close a file simply because time demands it. Sydney 1994 taught the city to be alert without being loud. Those who lived through the earliest days of the case now carry it differently. What was once shock has settled into something closer to vigilance. They remember how quickly certainty collapsed, how confidence gave way to suspicion, how the familiar became questionable overnight. This memory does not dominate their lives, but it shapes their instincts. They learned, slowly and without ceremony, that safety is not guaranteed by proximity or reputation. For the family, the passage of time has created a strange distance from the original pain, but not from its meaning. Grief has softened at the edges, losing its sharpest points, but it has not diminished. It has simply integrated, becoming part of how they understand the world. They no longer wait for answers. They live with them. And in doing so, they have discovered that endurance is not passive. It is an active, daily choice to continue without resolution. There are moments when the case resurfaces unexpectedly, triggered by something unrelated. A news story about another cold case reopened, a documentary revisiting old failures, a headline promising long-delayed justice. In those moments, the past does not rush back all at once. It arrives slowly, deliberately, reminding those who remember that not every story follows the arc we are taught to expect. Within institutions, Sydney 1994 has become less of a reference and more of a warning sign embedded in procedure, a reminder etched into policy rather than memory. Reviews are conducted differently. Doubt is given more space. Familiarity is questioned more aggressively. These changes are rarely attributed to any single case, yet their roots trace back here, to a time when assumption proved more dangerous than ignorance. The idea of finality continues to feel fragile, even with a conviction, even with years past. The case resists the comfort of an ending. This resistance is not defiance. It is honesty. Sydney 1994 exposes the fiction that justice, once delivered, restores balance. It shows instead that justice alters the shape of imbalance without eliminating it. The convicted man fades further into obscurity, his presence reduced to paperwork and routine. This fading is unsettling in its own way. It suggests that even the most consequential acts can become ordinary with enough time. The system moves on. The schedules continue. And yet the impact of what was done does not follow the same timetable. Harm lingers long after accountability becomes procedural. For those who study the case, the most disturbing element is no longer the crime itself, but the delay surrounding it. The years of silence, the missed connections, the moments when the truth was close enough to touch but remained unseen. These years carry their own weight, their own damage, their own unanswered questions. Sydney 1994 makes clear that delay is not neutral. It is an active force with consequences of its own. As conversations about the case grow rarer, their tone changes. There is less anger now, less urgency, but more gravity. When the case is mentioned, it is done carefully, with an awareness that it represents more than a single failure or success. It represents a fracture in trust, slowly repaired but never fully erased. The younger generation, encountering the case only through fragments, absorbs its lessons without knowing its full story. They inherit caution as culture, skepticism as instinct. This inheritance is quiet, almost invisible, but it ensures that the case continues to matter even as its details fade. Sydney 1994 ultimately leaves behind no satisfying conclusion. It offers no reassurance that truth will always arrive in time, or that justice will always feel complete. What it offers instead is a reminder that vigilance matters, that certainty should be questioned, that silence deserves attention. And as the case drifts further into the past, its presence remains, not as a headline, not as a scandal, but as a steady pressure beneath the surface of ordinary life. A reminder that some stories do not end when the questions are answered, but only when the questions stop being asked. And in Sydney, they never quite do. Escaped the boundaries of chronology. It no longer belongs to a single decade or generation. It exists outside of time, resurfacing whenever trust is tested, whenever certainty feels too easy, whenever a question lingers unanswered for just a moment too long. The case has become a reference not to the past, but to a state of awareness, a reminder that vigilance is learned, often painfully, and rarely forgotten. There is a particular stillness that surrounds stories like this once they are no longer actively discussed. Not silence, but a low, sustained quiet, as if the world has agreed not to disturb something fragile. Sydney carries that stillness now. The details remain accessible, archived, preserved, but they are no longer handled casually. People approach them with care, aware that reopening the story is not an intellectual exercise, but an emotional act with consequences that ripple outward. Those who once demanded answers now speak differently. Their voices carry less urgency but more weight. They no longer ask when justice will arrive. They ask what justice actually means when it comes so late. The case has stripped the concept down to its bones, revealing it as imperfect, conditional, shaped as much by timing as by intent. Sydney 1994 forces an uncomfortable recognition. Justice is not a destination, but a negotiation with reality. The city's relationship with the case has matured into something resembling coexistence. It does not deny what happened. It does not dwell on it either. Instead, it carries the knowledge forward, folded into daily life. This knowledge surfaces in subtle ways, in the way authorities respond faster to uncertainty, in the way communities resist easy explanations, in the way people are less willing to dismiss discomfort as coincidence. There are still moments when the story feels unfinished, not because facts are missing, but because understanding remains incomplete. Why trust lasted as long as it did? Why doubt arrived so late? Why certain voices were quieter than they should have been? These questions no longer seek answers. They exist as reminders of vulnerability, of how easily perception can be shaped by familiarity and fear of disruption. For the family, the case has become something they carry rather than something they confront. It no longer defines their days, but it shapes their nights, appearing in quiet reflections rather than sharp memories. They have learned that living forward does not require leaving the past behind. It requires integrating it, allowing it to exist without letting it consume everything else. This balance is not resolution, but it is survival. Within the justice system, Sydney 1994 is rarely cited by name now. Its influence is embedded too deeply for that. It lives in protocols that demand second looks, in review processes that resist haste, in a growing understanding that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The case has altered institutional reflexes in ways that are difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. The most unsettling aspect of the case, even now, is how ordinary it ultimately became. Not the crime itself, but its absorption into routine. The investigation that stalled. The years that passed. The resolution that arrived quietly, almost anticlimactically. This ordinariness challenges the expectation that extraordinary harm must always be met with extraordinary response. Sydney 1994 shows how easily devastation can be normalized if it is not actively resisted. As time continues to pass, the language around the case grows softer. Fewer absolutes, more nuance. Words like certainty and closure give way to recognition and responsibility. The shift is subtle but significant. It reflects a deeper understanding that some truths do not resolve, they recalibrate. The convicted man remains a distant figure, defined more by absence than presence. His silence has become part of the story, reinforcing its central discomfort. There is no final explanation to lean on, no confession that ties everything together. What remains is a gap that cannot be filled, only acknowledged. Sydney 1994 insists that this acknowledgement is enough, not to heal, but to remain honest. The case continues to influence how stories are told. Sensationalism feels inappropriate in its shadow. Neat endings feel suspect. There is greater respect for the long middle, the years of not knowing, of waiting, of living alongside uncertainty. This respect reshapes not only journalism and investigation, but public expectation itself. And so the Sydney 1994 cold case settles into its lasting form. Not a warning screamed into the dark, not a triumph held up for celebration, but a presence, steady, persistent, instructive, a reminder that truth can be delayed without disappearing, that justice can arrive without comfort, and that time, while relentless, does not erase responsibility. The story does not conclude with relief. It concludes with awareness, with the understanding that some cases never truly end, they simply become part of how a society sees itself. And in that sense, Sydney 1994 is not finished. It is ongoing, quietly shaping the space between what is known and what is still questioned.